What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about an X-Men book, Bishop's Crossing. This collects about a year and a half of some X-Men stories from the very early 90s. Uncanny X-Men issue 281 through 293 and Adjectiveless X-Men issue 8. And this is written by Jim Lee, Willis Portacio, John Byrne, and Scott Lobdell, and illustrated by Willis Portacio, John Romita Jr., Andy Kubert, Tom Rainey, Rurik Tyler, and Jim Lee. And this is immediately following Chris Claremont's 16-year run on Uncanny X-Men. His last issue on the book, I think, was issue 280, which was part of the Shadow King crossover storyline between Uncanny and X-Factor, and then Claremont did write the first 3 issues of Adjectiveless X-Men that started right around that same time where he was on his way out, and this is the beginning of the next generation, I guess you could say, of X-Men creators. You had Jim Lee and Willis Portacio. They were the ones doing the plotting, and then you see John Byrne's name in the credits here, and he was actually just scripting, which was really odd to me. John Byrne was a powerhouse creator even a decade before these comic books were coming out. It's really weird to me that they brought him in and then let him just do the scripting. Whenever you think about anything that John Byrne is well known for in comics, scripting is not really something that a lot of people think is his strongest suit. I'm not going to say that he's bad at scripting, but it's not something that I'm going to come in and let him do and only do that. If I want John Byrne on a comic, I want him to be in charge of the comic. You think of some of his creator-owned stuff like Danger Unlimited and XMen, which were both starting around this time or just a couple years later, and then Alpha Flight, which wasn't creator-owned, but he was writing and drawing that and was in charge of plotting as well. And those are some really good stories. I haven't read Alpha Flight in years, but I remember really enjoying it. So I'm very puzzled why they would bring in John Byrne and not have him do the drawing or be a little bit more involved with the story. But as I understand it, Jim Lee and Willis Portacio, they would come up with some kind of plot, and I don't know how detailed the plot was, but they had the plot, and then you had John Byrne and then later Scott Lobdell doing the more nuanced scripting, detailed, I guess I should say. And again, I don't really know how involved everyone was in the storytelling here. I don't know if John Byrne just got a plot and then turned in a script and that was it, or if he had anything to do with any of the storytelling that was going on here beyond creating dialogue for these characters. But I thought that was very odd. John Byrne, a very well-known creator at this point, he had already had a pretty lengthy run on Superman in the 80s, Fantastic Four in the 80s. He was just about to start getting into his creator-owned stuff at Image and Dark Horse. I don't know Image. It was Danger Unlimited and XMen. Those both might have been at Dark Horse now that I think about it. But anyway, I thought it was really weird seeing John Byrne's name on some of these issues, and not even all of them. It was just a few that he was credited as a scripter on. Anyway, I wanted to give this book a fair chance because over the years I have really fallen in love with Chris Claremont's run on Uncanny X-Men. There's a couple of rough spots in there, but overall I think that that is some really solid comics, especially for 16 years. If you take any other human being and put them on the same comic book for 16 years, they are going to face a little bit of burnout. I think that it is very good stuff considering that he went on that long. I don't think that even the bad stuff in that run is necessarily his fault. That could be its own video, how I could talk about how Chris Claremont was able to deal with executive meddling and people coming in and trying to do their own stuff in the world of the X-Men whenever he had kind of carved out his own little corner of the Marvel Universe, rightly or wrongly so. That could be its own video. But I really love Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men, and I don't much care for the way that Jim Lee kind of handled his partnership with Chris Claremont in the last couple of years of Claremont being on the X-Men. I kind of feel like Jim Lee did him dirty. Again, that's something that could be its own video. I'm also not a big fan of Jim Lee as an artist, and I know I'm in the minority there. I know everyone in the world has poo-pooed Rob Liefeld for being a really terrible artist, and I'm not going to say that I think Liefeld is a good artist, but I also don't think that Willis Portacio or Jim Lee are significantly better than Liefeld. I think that they are pretty bad also, and again, I know that I'm in the minority there. I know a lot of people really like Jim Lee's art. Anyway, I wanted to give this book a fair chance, even though I'm a really huge fan of Chris Claremont, and this is the stuff that came after he was basically pushed out the door, and I've heard a lot of bad things about the 90s X-Men comics, and if you look at my X-Men collection, collection, the 90s is where I have the most holes in my collection. I have stuff like the Onslaught Saga, Operation Zero Tolerance, Age of Apocalypse. I have a lot of those storylines, but then there's a lot of stuff in between that I don't have. And this, out of everything that's collected here, I think I had read 2 of the issues that are in this book before. One of them, issue 292, I think, I got that when I was first getting into comics, and I read that issue many times before. I hadn't read any of the stuff surrounding it, but I remembered everything about that comic. Whenever I turned a page in this book, I was like, oh, okay, this issue is collected here. But pretty much everything else here, I was aware of it, but I hadn't read any of it before. I had one of those books, The Ultimate Guide to the X-Men, that was published in the early 2000s, that was like basically covering 40 years of X-Men history in less than 200 pages, and so it talked about a lot of stuff that's covered in this book, like Bishop and the character of Trevor Fitzroy, and Mikhail Rasputin. He's a big part of this book. It talked about those characters, but at least in the case of Mikhail Rasputin, I was actually very misinformed about what his backstory was and the order of events that transpired with him, and I'll talk about that in a little bit if I can remember. Anyway, I knew about a lot of the stuff that happened in this book, but I had never read any of it before, and I wasn't really sure how it was going to play out. And I think that this book is okay. I like some of it on paper, but then in execution, I like it a little bit less. So I guess I should go ahead and start with the beginning. At first, we get the X-Men are in a sort of tense alliance with the Hellfire Club. At this point, the only remaining member of the inner circle of the Hellfire Club is Emma Frost, because like 1 or 2 months before this in X-Factor, Sebastian Shaw had been murdered by his son, Shinobi Shaw. And he shows up a little bit here. He and this guy, Trevor Fitzroy, who is a mutant from the future, they are part of the Upstarts. And the Upstarts were basically a bunch of younger bad guys who wanted to go around killing a bunch of people, and every time they would kill someone, they would get points in this game that was never really explained. And at least in this book, it's implied that Selene, she is this like thousands-year-old vampire, kind of. She sucks energy out of people to remain young. She is apparently somehow involved with the Upstarts, but then later on, the Upstarts, they're around for a few years. I think they were still around in the around the time when Fatal Attractions was going on, I think. I remember there was a crossover between New Warriors and X-Force that involved the Upstarts, I think. And I'll be honest, I've never really liked any of these characters. I've never found any of them interesting. They have this game that they're playing. There's this character called the Games Master, who later on, he was the one kind of arbitrating who would get points for certain kills, and I just never cared. I never really knew what the stakes were for this game, and I never knew that Selene was involved with the Upstarts. Apparently, they didn't even know that she was involved with this either, but later on she was not involved with them, so I don't know what happened there. But I was never really on board with the Upstarts. I never found any of them to be very interesting. I especially don't like that basically the Hellfire Club is completely eliminated so that the Upstarts can be the next big bad guy that the X-Men face. I feel like you are removing a fairly interesting group of bad guys that have a lot of interesting possibilities for future stories. You're taking them out of the toy box and throwing that in the garbage, and then you're introducing something that is not nearly as interesting. Now, you might argue the Hellfire Club have been around for 10 years by this point. They've had their chance. Now we're going to get rid of them and we're going to do something new. Okay, but what did you do with the Upstarts? Not a whole lot. They go around killing unimportant characters, and then they get points in this game that's never really explained. That's all that you did with these nothing characters. I don't know anyone who cares about Shinobi Shaw or Trevor Fitzroy. I don't. So anyway, by this point, in the span of like 2 months, you have Sebastian Shaw allegedly killed, and then many years later, like sometime after the Age of Apocalypse, you find out that Sebastian Shaw is still alive, and then Emma Frost is put into a coma, and that is actually going to eventually lead into her waking up and co-running Generation X with Banshee. So if you like her as a good guy, that kind of gets its start here, although you wouldn't know that reading this book, because she still acts pretty evil in this, but she goes into a coma, and that eventually does lead into her reforming and kind of becoming an ally of the X-Men. Anyway, so Trevor Fitzroy is a mutant from the future, and somehow he's able to absorb life force from people, and that is able to give him energy so that he can jump into the past. That's his mutant power, I guess, and then once he has jumped into the past, he cannot jump back into the future. And he brings a whole bunch of mutant supervillains that were imprisoned with him in the future back into the past. And so Bishop and 2 of his friends in Xavier's security enforcers. They're basically mutant police. Their names are Malcolm and Randall. They follow Fitzroy back into the past to try and bring him back into the future, and then they find out, oh, we're stuck here. We're not going to be able to bring all these guys back to the future. So then Bishop says, well, since these mutants are dangerous to everyone here in the past, we're going to have to kill all of these guys. And so Bishop kind of comes into conflict with the X-Men because they don't know who this Fitzroy guy is, and they don't know who this Bishop guy is, but he's going around killing all these mutants, so we're going to have to stop him. And he is the biggest fanboy of the X-Men from his time period. He basically worshipped the ground that the X-Men used to walk on back in their day, so he is a huge fan of the X-Men, but he doesn't believe that the X-Men are actually the X-Men. He says, well, since you guys are trying to stop me, you're clearly not the X-Men. So he gets in a few scuffles with the X-Men before he finally believes that they are the X-Men, and then eventually Bishop has a conversation with Professor X that we don't even get to see, and then Professor X says, guess what, guys? Bishop is now an X-Man. And then we get to see several conversations between him and Storm about how killing is bad, and you don't need to do that, and only as a last resort. And there's one point in this book where Jean Grey is forced to kill someone, and she's sad about it, but it rings a little hollow when all of the X-Men keep fussing at Bishop for trying to kill the bad guys, and it's situations where, yeah, he does it a lot, but it seems like he doesn't really have any other options, and then Jean Grey does it, and nobody calls her out on that. I thought that was a little weird, but anyway, it does seem strange that Bishop has killed a lot of people, and the news people are aware of it. Trish Tilby, that was Beast's kind of on-again, off-again girlfriend from X Factor, she is over here reporting about there's this mutant gang with M tattoos on their face, and they're going around killing other mutants, and everyone should know that it's Bishop. Anytime they're out in the middle of the city, people are going to see this guy with an M tattoo, and they're going to say, hey, he was on the news. He killed a whole bunch of people. And in fact, there are some police officers from the present day who try to arrest Bishop, and then he shoots at them. Now, he claims that he's just trying to scare them, but it seems a little weird that Professor X is so ready to have Bishop be one of the X-Men. That seems like something that would have been a harder sell to make than what it was, but they kind of do it as an end-of-the-issue reveal, and then it's like, okay, he's a member of the X-Men now. But anyway, before we get to Bishop joining the X-Men, actually, the X-Men go to this island where Sunfire and members of the Russian government are investigating this hole in the ground. And it turns out this is a portal to another dimension. And the X-Men and Sunfire, they get sucked into this other dimension, and there's a big civil war going on there, and that is where we meet Mikhail Rasputin. That is Colossus's older brother, who was briefly mentioned in like X-Men issue 99, I think. This was before Jean Grey ever got the Phoenix powers. Colossus mentions him offhand like he had a brother who was a cosmonaut, and then I don't think they ever mention Mikhail again. So I'm kind of surprised that these guys, like 15 years later, are referencing and actually bringing back this character Mikhail, but he has lived in this alternate reality, and at one time he had married a princess in this world, and then he accidentally killed her and her father, so he went into hiding, and his power is energy manipulation. Pretty much whenever you can tell that a writer is kind of stuck on what a character's powers can be, so it's just like, okay, energy powers. In this case, energy manipulation, which I guess is a little better than energy blast, like in the case of Bishop, but if I had $1 for every time a character has energy powers, I would never have to work another day in my life. But anyway, eventually Mikhail is able to return back to Earth with the X-Men and close up this hole that leads to this other world, because if the hole is left open, then it's going to be a danger to Earth and this other world. And I kind of like the stuff going on with Mikhail. He feels guilty about killing all these people accidentally, and if he tries to close this portal again, he's probably going to kill some more people. I kind of like that, and I like the relationship between him and Colossus. You didn't hear about Mikhail very much at all in the previous 16 years of stories, but you can tell here, Storm says Colossus pretty much idolized you, and he was always doing what he thought you would do in a situation like that. And while that's probably not true, since you very rarely hear about Mikhail before this, I kind of buy it here. So I like the back and forth between these two characters, and then they bring Mikhail back to the mansion. And then he's kind of laying down in bed for a few issues. We don't see him a whole lot. And then at one point, he accidentally bumps into this pizza guy because Colossus and Mikhail, they are going to go back to Russia. Because Mikhail, he hasn't seen his parents in years. He didn't even know that he has a younger sister who, I guess that means that it's been at least 5 years that he was stuck in another dimension. I don't know in comic book time how long Colossus has been with the X-Men, but Mikhail was presumed dead before Colossus ever joined the X-Men. And Illyana, she looked like she was maybe 5 in Giant Size X-Men issue 1. So I'm guessing that it's been at least 5 years since Mikhail didn't even know about Illyana at all. But anyway, they are going to go back home so that Mikhail can get reacquainted with his parents and the sister that he didn't know he had. And then I'm kind of jumping all over the place because there's 2 or 3 subplots that are going on in this book, and I kind of want to tackle all of them and give them their proper due. But then out of nowhere, Mikhail kind of just goes insane. At one point, Callisto, who used to be the leader of the Morlocks, in the closing years of Claremont's run on X-Men, Mask had turned Callisto into a pretty woman. She used to be, I don't want to say she was ugly, but they do say that in this book. They say she used to be really attractive, and then she used to not be really attractive, and then Mask made her attractive, and then she was beat up by a whole bunch of Morlocks because she didn't want to go back and be their leader. They didn't have a leader anymore. Mask was killed in X-Force, early issues of X-Force, and so the Morlocks didn't have a leader. She didn't want to go back to them, so they beat her up, and then she comes to the mansion, and then this healer Morlock, I don't even think he had a name. They just call him the healer. He kind of looks like a cross between Merlin and Santa Claus. Anyway, he heals Callisto, and that undoes her hotification. Like I said, I don't think that she was ugly. She just looked really rough. Like she didn't shower, like her hair was really messy, but she didn't look ugly necessarily, but the book is kind of saying that she was. And so anyway, she is now upset with the Morlocks, and she wants to go and kick butt because they beat her up and resulted in her losing her good looks. And for some reason, Mikhail Rasputin has a telepathic bond with Callisto because of Colossus. He was kind of sort of in love with Callisto. At one time, he had lost his memories, and he thought that his name was Peter Nikolaevich or something like that. Long story short, he went through a portal, lost his memories, and then he was kind of sort of in a relationship with Callisto, and that was part of a big ploy by Mask of the Morlocks. And so because of Colossus's bond with Callisto, Mikhail is somehow able to bond with Callisto. And so Mikhail, who is a guest at the X-Men's mansion, he decides that he is going to help Callisto go and beat up a whole bunch of Morlocks. And then he tells the X-Men that he feels bad, he feels guilty about killing all those people in that alternate dimension that he was in, so now he wants to kill all the Morlocks and atone for what he did. It does not make any sense at all. This heel-face turn comes completely out of nowhere. I buy that Mikhail, I buy that he feels guilty about all these people that died at his hand in this other reality, but I don't buy that suddenly he starts attacking the X-Men and he wants to kill the Morlocks for some reason. That all came completely out of nowhere. I kind of like the idea of Mikhail deciding that he needs to be a leader and the Morlocks don't have a leader, and so he goes down there to lead them, but then him saying that he's going to kill them all, that was just really weird. But I think it could have been really interesting if he said, these people need me, and I was really good at being a leader for a time, and then I failed my people in that other dimension, so now I'm going to be their leader here. I think that could have been really interesting, but it needed a lot more setup. It was not handled well at all. Callisto here is handled very poorly. Before Chris Claremont left the X-Men books, she was pretty close to being an ally to the X-Men, and now suddenly, for some reason, she wants to fight Charles Xavier to the death. She's going around, like, destroying Storm's room. Storm hasn't really done anything to Callisto recently. When we first met Callisto, like, 10 years before this, Storm fought Callisto in a duel, but they were way past that at this point. It feels like the writers of this era of the X-Men, they could not wait to get rid of all the stuff that Chris Claremont had set up in his time in the X-Men. So the very first thing they do, they get rid of the Hellfire Club. And then the next thing they do, they get rid of all the Morlocks that had survived the Mutant Massacre. They have Callisto back to being evil. She doesn't like the X-Men for some reason, and then she kind of sort of dies. And then also, there's some more stuff going on here. It feels like they were really just trying their hardest to get rid of all the stuff that was being set up and being established before they came on the books. You have this character Opal, who is dating Iceman, and it's hinted that she is going to break up with Iceman because there was this other guy from Japan who had a thing for her, and then he dies in this book, and she acts like she's more torn up about that than she would have been if Iceman had died, because Iceman says something like, why didn't he wait for me? He hit the self-destruct button on his armor. Why didn't he wait for me? And she says, it's all about honor, which is something I don't think you would understand. And Opal was set up in X Factor as being a love interest for Iceman in the last 10 or 15 issues before Louise Simonson left X Factor, and then it seems to me that they weren't really interested in following up on that, so let's get rid of that other thing that we didn't have any hand in bringing into the X-Men books. Forge, he was with the X-Men around this time, and he still had feelings for Storm. This brings up that time that she and Forge were stuck in another reality, a different reality than the one that Mikhail was in, and they kind of fell in love in that reality, and then they were kind of forced to part ways because the X-Men, they faked their deaths, and Forge was not with them when they did that, and then eventually he kind of rejoined the X-Men. He helped Banshee rescue some of the X-Men around the time when they were scattered all over the world, and then here Forge is kind of upset that he and Storm still kind of have feelings for each other, but she is putting the X-Men ahead of their relationship, and then he asks Storm to marry him, and I'm thinking, okay, cool, I know that these two don't marry each other, but maybe they're going to draw this out for like 5 or 10 issues and make us think that something is going to happen, and then they can find an actual good reason for these two to not get married. No, in the very next issue, Forge decides to rescind his offer to marry him, and Mystique, she is like in the span of a page gone insane because Destiny died at the hands of the Shadow King, and Mystique feels guilty about that, and Forge says, Mystique needs me, Storm, you don't need me, you have the X-Men, and you're not going to want to leave the X-Men, so I don't want to marry you. So then he and Mystique leave, and she was, I guess, living at the mansion because she and Wolverine had had a team-up adventure in his own comic. I've read that comic, but I don't remember what happened there with that team-up story. But I guess Forge and Mystique, they're eventually going to join X Factor in a few years. I know eventually they're on X Factor together, but this is another thing. Forge and Storm being a couple and kind of sort of having a relationship, and these guys, well, we didn't have anything to do with that, so let's get rid of that too. There's all these elements from the Claremont era, and not just from Chris Claremont's X-Men, but also Louise Simonson's X Factor. You had Archangel, who was in a relationship with Charlotte Jones. She calls Archangel at one point, but we don't actually see her, and Archangel tells Bobby that her dating a blue-skinned Angel of Death isn't the best thing for her. So all these things that are from X Factor and X-Men before these guys came on board, it's like they don't care about any of that. So instead of actually doing something interesting with those elements, they're just throwing it all away and introducing, in my opinion, stuff that isn't as good. I kind of like some of the stuff with Mikhail, but it's handled really weird. Once he comes to the mansion, it's like, oh, we don't want 2 Rasputins at the mansion. Let's go ahead and find a way to quickly get rid of him. And I wish that they had found a better way to do that. But also, you have the introduction of the storyline of the traitor among the X-Men. In the future, Bishop, he arrested Trevor Fitzroy, and while they were in the subway tunnels looking for Trevor, they accidentally wander into the basement of the X-Mansion, and they find some 70-year-old message from Jean Grey talking about the traitor of the X-Men. And of course, this being a really old message, it doesn't age very well. It's very garbled, but you hear bits and pieces of the message. She says something about a traitor, and then she says, we should never have trusted, and then it cuts out, and then she says, we knew very little about, and then it cuts out again. And then Bishop goes and talks to this guy, the Witness, who his name is LeBeau. And then he comes back in time. Eventually, he joins the X-Men, and then when he's being introduced to everybody, Gambit calls him Pup. And that's something that the Witness did. He called him Pup in the future. And so it's very heavily implied that the Witness is LeBeau, somehow. Because that's 70 years in the future. That means that Gambit would be like 100, maybe 90, maybe. But he'd be closer to 100, I think. Somehow he's still alive in the future, and he's got these half-naked women like falling all over him, and he's, you know, just a big pile of melting skin. But anyway, Bishop is like, oh, okay, he's the traitor. And he's trying to tell the X-Men that Gambit is going to betray the X-Men. And they're all basically like, yeah, we don't believe you. We've known Gambit a little bit longer. And very clearly, they did not know what they were doing here, because eventually, all these guys, Jim Lee and Willis Portacio, the ones who are doing the story here, they leave Marvel Comics and they go and form Image Comics. And then a few years down the line, we get the Fatal Attraction storyline where Professor X gets angry and then he mind wipes Magneto. And then after that, a year or two later, we get the Onslaught storyline, which is basically the evil of Magneto is mixed with the telepathy of Charles Xavier, and we get this big evil psychic monster, and that basically says that Onslaught is the traitor among the X-Men, or Professor X. Very clearly, that is not what they were planning. I have read somewhere that Onslaught, basically, someone working on the X-Men books at the time said, hey, I have this really cool name for a villain, Onslaught, let's create something to match that name. So they were not planning this traitor among the X-Men thing out very far at the time. Or if they were, it did not end up happening the way that they planned it. My theory is that Bishop was planned to be the traitor among the X-Men, because Jean Grey talks about we should never have trusted someone, and we knew very little about someone. And then Bishop comes back and says, it's Gambit. Gambit is the newest member of your team, and we don't know very much about him, and in the future, he's the only one who's still alive, and he wouldn't tell me anything about the fall of the X-Men. It's got to be Gambit. And the thing is, that's what the book wants you to think. That is the red herring. Very rarely in a mystery is the red herring actually going to be the answer to the mystery. And so it could not possibly have been Gambit. If it was, that would have been very bad storytelling, very bad writing. So the next newest X-Men was Bishop. And I'm thinking maybe they were going to try and find a way for Bishop to be ingratiated among the X-Men, ingratiated among the fans, and then find a really good reason for Bishop to betray the X-Men. That would have been really hard to pull off because he was such a fanboy of the X-Men, but it would have been really interesting to see. Years later, in Messiah Complex in 2008, we did get Bishop betraying the X-Men, and it wasn't handled very well. I did not like that because by that point, we had had almost 20 years of character development for him. I think it would have been really cool if this Bishop betraying the X-Men thing happened in like 1995, but that didn't happen. Eventually we got the Onslaught story instead, but I do think that that would have been an interesting direction to go, but ultimately it never panned out. I'm not even sure if the people writing this story actually had any idea who the traitor was going to be, but that's about it. We get some interesting Bishop Storm stuff here. It seems like they were seeding a possible romance between those two. I don't know if they ever actually got romantically involved, but it definitely looks like they're leaning in that direction here. But overall, would I recommend this book? I don't know. It doesn't do it for me, but if you don't have the love for Chris Claremont's 16 years on the book, if this was the first X-Men book you had read, I still don't think it's very well written. It's got a lot of early 90s stuff in it that doesn't really do anything for me. I don't think that some of it is very well written. But overall, if you didn't have as much X-Men love as I do, I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, I'm high and mighty, I love the X-Men. If you're more of a casual X-Men fan than I am, let's say it like that, you might like this book a little bit more than I do. And I forgot to say something about Mikhail Rasputin. Here's what I thought happened, okay? Mikhail Rasputin is declared dead before we ever meet Colossus, because when we first see Colossus in Giant Size X-Men, it's him, his mom and dad, and his younger sister. We don't see Mikhail at all, and then a few issues later, Colossus is thinking about his brother, the cosmonaut who died. He's presumed dead, and then many years later, here's what I thought happened. Many years later, we find out that somehow Mikhail Rasputin is jaunted to this other reality, that did happen, where he was able to raise all these little young Morlocks who survived the mutant massacre. That's what I thought happened, but that's not what happened. Now, Gambit, he did rescue some of the young Morlocks from the mutant massacre. At least one of them was Marrow. And then these Morlocks, somehow, they were transported to another dimension called the Hill, I think, and then time passed much faster there than it did here. So Marrow, who is like 5 or 6, she's like in her early to mid-20s the next time we see her, or the first time we see her, which is in Generation X. And I thought that all of that happened before we ever met Mikhail. But then when we see Mikhail here, there's no mention of the Morlocks. There's an alternate reality, but it's not the Hill. It's a different alternate reality. And I'm assuming after he is presumed dead here, because the tunnels kind of collapse with him, Callisto, and the rest of the Morlocks, and I'm assuming from there he teleports him and the other Morlocks into the Hill, where he tries to raise them, and I don't know what happens next. Somehow the adult the kid Morlocks who became adults, they come back to Earth and they become Gene Nation, a group of terrorists. I don't think any of that was very well planned out because by the time you get to Gene Nation, which is early Generation X, that's Scott Lobdell by himself. He doesn't have Jim Lee or Willis Portacio plotting anything. So maybe he was reaching back to the story that he was involved with scripting. I don't know. But anyway, it turns out the backstory of Mikhail Rasputin was a little different than what I was under the impression that it was. It's still weird to me that you have this character, Marrow, who is allegedly a Morlock who survived the Morlock massacre, and then she was in the tunnels. In theory, she would have been there during this story when all this stuff was going on, but we never see anyone who looks like Marrow. When she's first introduced, they're acting like she's a character who's been around for a while, but she's not. But anyway, that's not in this book here. I'm just rambling about X-Men stuff. That's what I do. So anyway, that's about all that I have for this video. I know that I went on a little long-winded with this one, but I thought this book was okay. I tried to give it a fair shot. I don't think that it's very good, but that doesn't mean that everything in the 90s after Chris Claremont left is bad. I do think there's some bright spots in the 90s. I just don't think that this is one of those spots. So anyway, that's about all that I have to say today. I hope that you guys like this video. In the meantime, I will see you guys in the future. Have a good one.